Okay, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Maciej Turek, and it will be my great pleasure to moderate this meeting in a series that is called Transatlantic Encounters, jointly organized by the Institute of American Studies and Polish Diaspora and Transatlantic Studies program at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. As you might know, both the Institute and TAS program has always been famous for organizing this kind of special guest lectures on a variety of issues. Unfortunately, for a year now, we have been living through this groundhog months when every day, every month seems to be the same. But we just thought that maybe we can renew this tradition of guest discussions remotely to give something beyond regular classes, to give some opportunity to look at the important issues of the day from different angles and to discuss some transatlantic relation oriented issues. And our guest today is Professor Jan Hornat from the Charles University in Prague, who will speak about promoting democracy globally, the role of the US and the EU democracy assistance. And just a short note that the format of the meeting will be that Professor Hornat will be speaking for about 40-45 minutes. Then we'll have about half an hour for a Q&A session. And if anyone would have a question, please feel free to either write it on the chat forum of the meeting or just raise your hands after the questions and answer session will start. And I hope our guests will address them. And few words about Professor Hornat, which is my great pleasure to introduce to you. Professor Hornat is the head of Department of North American Studies at Charles University, and in his research, he focuses mainly on transatlantic relations and the perceptions of democracy in the US and the EU. So he has published numerous academic articles and monographs with such publishing houses as Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, and Charles University Press. And he's also a researcher within the Peace Research Center Prague and a member of the Virus Impact team of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, which examines the geopolitical impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. And in the past, he was also the head of a unit of Department of European Programs of the Ministry of Justice of Czech Republic. So it sounds Professor Hornat is quite a busy man, and therefore appreciate he agreed to find some time to today's Transatlantic Encounters. So thank you very much, Jan. It's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maciej, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure and great honor to be invited to speak to you all and to your students. Thanks for that introduction. I think I have nothing more to add. Just a disclosure: if you hear some strange background noises, the reason is that we're in lockdown in Czech Republic, and my children are home, and they tend to be quite loud sometimes. So I apologize for that up front. Okay, so. At this point, I will share my presentation. I have prepared some slides for you, so I hope you see this. Maciej, if there's any technical problems, just let me know during the talk. Okay, so how am I going to structure the 40 minutes I have? I'm usually not very good with time management. I tend to speak longer than the time that is given to me, but I will try to keep the time. Okay. So first up, what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to give you a little bit of that empirical background into what mechanisms and instruments the United States and the European Union have to promote democracy, to assist democracy abroad. We're going to look at a little bit of that historical evolution of this practice. And then we're going to dig into some of the more problematic questions as to what type of democracy is the US and the EU promoting, and how does this affect the recipient countries. And then we are going to sort of finish off with examining the question of actually why, all right? Why the EU and the US promote democracy? What's in it for them, right? And we are shortly also going to address the question of whether democracy assistance actually works. And that's, we'll sort of leave that as an open question that we can follow on into the discussion part of this seminar, which I'm obviously looking forward to. So let's dive right into it. And perhaps the first question that we can start with, if we want to conceptualize democracy assistance, democracy promotion, is to look whether there is a period in time to which we can trace the beginnings of the practice of democracy promotion. So some would argue that, for example, the United States has always been a country that has promoted democracy throughout its history. To some extent that might be true, but we should make that distinction as to how the United States has been promoting democracy in the past. So let's say in the 19th century, right, the United States conceived of itself as the city upon a hill, and you all are students of the United States, of American history to some extent, so you know the very famous sermon by John Winthrop from 1620 on aboard the Arbella ship, saying that all eyes are upon them, the first settlers sort of coming into the United States, and that the new society is going to be a city upon a hill for everyone to emulate, right? So this is one form of promoting democracy by example, right? Simply building a strong enough institutions, democratic institutions at home, right? Being effective, providing well-being for the people, right? And by that example, that shining city upon a hill, right, will by itself transform other societies across the world, right? So this is a very passive form of promoting democracy, just building democracy at home. And that was one of the perceptions of, for example, Thomas Jefferson, right? Even the Jeffersonian type of foreign policy in American foreign politics is the one that focuses on building American society and American democratic institutions, because that's the best way to forward the American national interest. So for most of American history, actually, America has been this exemplarist nation, right? The city upon a hill that's quite passive in promoting democracy. Some of the first instances, right, that we can find where U.S. foreign policy was driven by, let's say, human rights issues, for example, was the war between U.S. and Spain over Cuba, right? But nonetheless, still at that time, it was not really conceived as as a war to promote democracy. The Cold War perhaps made a change in this, right, where some of the reforms or some of the attempts to cause revolution in socialist countries in Latin America, for example, were mostly conducted by CIA, right? So these were covert operations that nonetheless were aimed at, if not promoting democracy and building democratic political systems abroad, they were aimed at sort of destroying non-democratic systems, right? If I say diplomatically. The activist role in American foreign policy in truly explicitly promoting democracy, right, came in the time of Ronald Reagan. And that one period in history where we can identify, right, where the United States sort of even shifted its foreign policy in terms of being conducting covert operations to change regimes around the world. Ronald Reagan said, well, you know, it's part of the Cold War, this ideological war, that's something we should not be ashamed of, and we should explicitly, right, be on the forefront and battle for democracy, right? So his very famous Westminster speech in 1982, he's calling not just on, America, but the Western world to build an infrastructure of democracy at home, right? To build institutions, right, that will explicitly have the role to promote and further democratic governance around the globe, right? So since then, since the 1980s, we can see, and until this day, there exists a number of organizations, right, institutions, mechanisms, funding schemes, etc., that have a clear goal, right, and that are mandated by their governments to export and to support democratic movements, democratic civil societies around the globe, right? So after Reagan's Westminster speech in 1982, he commissioned the creation of this so-called democracy program, which was supposed to come up with a model organization, right, that would function within the structure of the US government somehow, right, and have the role that previously the CIA had to some extent in terms of, you know, building democracy in third countries. But this time, this would be a very sort of transparent organization, right? Because again, that for Reagan, that's nothing to be ashamed of. If you're building democracy, if you're subverting non-democratic regimes within the context of the Cold War, right? So this democracy program that was funded, the research that was funded by the American government, ended up in creating or recommending the creation of the so-called National Endowment for Democracy, which is probably one of the most famous, let's say, or in some parts of the world, obviously infamous organizations supporting democracy. It's a so-called quango, right? This is the term that was used actually by the democracy program, a quasi non-governmental organization. The thing is that the National Endowment for Democracy is funded by the U.S. Congress. It has earmarked funding for within every year. Currently, it's about 170 million US dollars. So that's not, you know, a very big budget that they operate with. But at the same time, so it receives money from the US Congress, but it's autonomous in terms of its decision making and where that money is actually going to go, right? It decides by itself. It's obviously, but this link, the fact that the Congress has its hand on the purse of the National Endowment for Democracy does, you know, make it somehow, you know, that the NED has to be complicit in, you know, U.S. foreign policy goals, etc., etc. But nonetheless, it has some autonomous structure, right? It's not part of the U.S. government, right? So this is the 1983 when the National Endowment for Democracy is created. In the 1990s, after the transformations and the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the USAID, the huge American development organization, also builds its own departments that focus on transitions, right? So it's a reaction to the external context, right? So there's opening in Eastern Europe, right? And the United States is seeking for ways to help build the democratic systems on the one hand, but also the market economies in Eastern Europe, right? So there's more funding coming through the USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, into Eastern Europe, right? So these are, let's say, the core instruments of the American government, and at the same time, obviously, the State Department has its own funding, it has its own programs, it has its own department on human rights and democracy. Which again was created in the early 1990s, right, as a reaction to the external context. On the European side, or on the EU side, right, the situation is somewhat different, right? The European community in general, obviously, is somewhat of a latecomer to promoting democracy or assisting democracy, but the first budgets that emerge within the EU budget related to democracy assistance also come up in the later 1980s, right? The first explicit and you know, European community mandated funding that went to support pro-democracy movements that we can trace are in 1986 related to the support for NGOs and civil society organizations in Chile, right? That was the run-up to the referendum related to the prolongation of Pinochet's rule. So, so that's about the time that the European Union or the European Community at that time starts to enter the game of explicitly promoting democracy. And again, since then, it has consolidated and centralized its mechanisms to some extent, right? And made them permanent. in, for example, what we call the European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights, right? An instrument within the European Commission that is used to support civil society groups that focus on democracy and human rights all around the globe, right? And then we have, of course, the the Eastern neighborhood policy, or in general, the European neighborhood policy that has mechanisms and funding to support civil society groups, political organizations, but mostly sending out experts, for example, into neighborhood countries' governments. This is the so-called TAIEX program, and this is something that Eastern European countries have also experienced with in the run-up to their membership to the European Union. It's a program of exchanging experts, right? These experts might be helping in drafting new laws or implementing EU regulation, etc., right? And then we of course have individual member states, European member states, who have their own funds, right, and funding for democracy, right? Especially the Eastern European countries, notably Poland and Czech Republic, have their programs. The transition program that the Czech Republic has, which has a budget of about 2 million euros every year, and is directly under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the transition program is coordinated and is driven by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Poland, the situation is a little bit different. Poland has the Solidarity Fund, which receives most of its funding, about 3.5 million euros every year, from the Polish government. But it copies more the National Endowment for Democracy in terms of having more autonomy and not being directly linked to the Polish Foreign Ministry or the government, right? So these are just, and we have, many more instruments, and we can, look into these during our discussion. But, I sometimes find, because I, teach a similar course on at the university, and when I'm speaking to students in the very first class, when they come and sort of talk about generally what democracy promotion is, they have somewhat of a skewed vision of what it is. For most people, when they hear the term democracy promotion, they envision, okay, that's the U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003, right? Something that didn't really work out well, right? So there's this contextualization of democracy promotion with brute force, right? That there's a forceful transformation of power that is driven by the Americans and by the Europeans. But there's much more subtle mechanisms that both actors have, right? So let's just very briefly look at the funding, so you guys can conceptualize how much funding goes into democracy promotion on the U.S. side and on the side of EU institutions. So both actors devote about $3 billion US dollars every year to activities related to democracy promotion. And obviously it's not very easy to identify what actually can be earmarked and identified as democracy promotion. So these numbers, sometimes vary, but it's about $3 billion every year. And just so that you can, have the comparison as to what this number, how this number plays out in the overall U.S. budget. This is actually Obama's budget from 3 or 4 years ago. But just for heuristics, it's only about 3 tiny little squares from the entire U.S. federal budget, right? And it would be very much similar within the EU. Right? Now to the more interesting stuff. As I said, we have many mechanisms, many approaches, many strategies on how democracy can be promoted, how Western democratic states can promote and assist democracy abroad, right? And it's not just physical intervention, military intervention, but there are other means of how to do that, right? And obviously, some of these strategies are less intrusive, meaning that they intrude less on the national sovereignty of the recipient states, and some are more intrusive in terms of a real, material, physical intervention into that country, and that obviously very much breaches the state sovereignty of the recipient, right? But let's start with the least intrusive, right? So we can have rhetorical commitments, right? So this is something when Obama or Catherine Ashton or whomever high the political elites and the leaders of democratic countries commit, let's say, on some public forum to supporting, let's say, quite recently the opposition movement in Belarus, right? So these might be just rhetorical commitments which are symbolic and which somehow empower, let's say, the opposition in the recipient country, seeing that, okay, so if we win this fight, we are going to have support at least among these Western countries, right? So these rhetorical commitments, although they might not be followed by some practical steps, nonetheless, they have some symbolic value that can, mobilize, let's say, more people, right? Mobilize more people to join, let's say, the political movements, and have this empowering effect, right? Then we have what I call political gestures, right? One of these political gestures, which is sort of more hands-on experience, is an example from Czechoslovakia in 1988, when the French President François Mitterrand visited Prague, and he made a breakfast reception actually for the most pronounced Czechoslovak dissidents at that time, among them Václav Havel, right? So again, this is, you might think, okay, so this was some breakfast, they had toast and juice, etc., and then they went home. But again, the symbolism, right, and the empowerment, in the sense that I spoke to some of these dissidents who are still alive now, and who have attended the meeting, and they said, for us it was an extremely empowering moment in terms of, look, this is the president of one of the strongest democracies in the world, one of the strongest countries in the world in general, and he is giving us legitimacy. He's giving us political legitimacy, seeing us as forces, political forces within the system, right? So for them, it was an extremely empowering moment, right? And we can see similar political gestures even now out of the context of the Cold War. For example, Michael McFaul, whom you might recognize, he's an academic, and in 2012 he became the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's actually an academic that focuses on the topic of democracy promotion, right? And in his second day in office, even before meeting any officials from the Russian government, he met with anti-government bloggers, anti-government Russian bloggers, right? And this caused an uproar, and Putin never wanted to see Michael McFaul again, and very soon he left as ambassador in Russia because he couldn't get anything done, because no one would want to speak to him. But again, this was this moment where he was trying to, again, give legitimacy and even some PR to these people as somehow a legitimate force within the Russian society, right? Another point is conditionality, right? We have positive and negative conditionality. The positive conditionality is usually the carrots and sticks, right? So we can characterize it as carrots and sticks. The carrots are, which is something that the European Union often uses, meaning, for example, towards the countries that have experienced the Arab Spring, right? Saying, if you work on these reforms, political liberalization, protection of human rights, market reform, etc., etc., we're going to give you more access to the European market. We're going to send you more development support if you conduct these reforms, right? So that's the positive conditionality. But then we have the negative conditionality, which is, for example, something practiced by the United States towards Cuba, right? Saying, unless you liberalize, right, we're not going to do business with you, right? And we're going to maintain the embargo, etc., etc., right? So this is the negative conditionality that is more often used by the United States, and I don't really, I haven't really come up to an example of when the European Union has used this negative conditionality, right? Then the other point is technical assistance to governments, which we talked about, sending experts. This is, again, a mechanism that mostly the European Union uses, and it has various mechanisms like the TAIEX. You might also know the twinning programs, right? Twinning two institutions from like Eastern European countries with Western European countries, non-member countries. And providing some expertise. But it is something also that the United States has done, for example, when it occupied post-war Japan, right? In terms of writing the Japanese Constitution, right? So you had a team of American lawyers, constitutional lawyers, who wrote the Japanese Constitution, had it very quickly translated, and then it became, you know, Constitution. It became the law. It became the Constitution, right? So. And usually this technical assistance, unless it was, you know, the post-war period in Japan or in Germany, mostly these technical assistants and these experts are invited by the recipient governments. So, you know, we may argue as to how intrusive actually it is, because they usually are invited. So, and then the more sort of problematic and what the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes always, you know, bash and criticize the West is direct material support to civil society and any sort of anti-authoritarian government movements, right? And so usually how this happens, so the European Union, but also US funding is used, for example, to help NGOs, civil society groups, but even emerging political parties, underground political parties, etc., in buying them computers, you know, telephones, even furniture into their offices, helping to pay for the rent, etc. Even during the Cold War, the National Endowment for Democracy, and this very much, you know, well known example with supporting Polish solidarity movement, but also supporting individual dissidents in Czechoslovakia, or supporting families of dissidents that were jailed, right, during communism. But this direct material support to civil society is still something that is happening around the world. For example, the Czech transition promotion program that I was talking about has been, you know, for the last decade or so, helping, you know, and supporting Belarusian civil society. The same with the Solidarity Fund of Poland, right? So this is where it gets, you know, this is where it clashes with state sovereignty, right? For example, in Russia, and Russia has banned the National Endowment of Democracy from operating on its territory for these particular reasons. And then we have information dissemination, right? And one of the most notable examples is radio broadcasts, right? Especially during the Cold War, like the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. But still today we can see it, for example, when South Korea, and at this time it's the civil society groups, but when South Korean civil society groups send over these balloons to North Korea over the border with like information leaflets, DVDs, and whatsoever, so that this gets to like the wider public. So if you have the direct material support to civil society, these are the people who are engaged in some opposition to the government, right? But if you have like radio broadcasts that are very hard to jam, right, or even TV broadcasts, right, or online broadcasts, this can potentially get to the wider public and influence, right, the wider public on a greater basis, right? So, for example, you might know that the Polish government is funding the so-called Belsat TV, which is a television that, or an online television, mostly now, that is intended to Belarusian citizens, so that they have access to some alternative information than is provided by their totalitarian government, right? And then obviously the last and the most intrusive point is physical intervention, regime change, right, which most recently happened in Iraq, right? So this is in a nutshell what democracy promotion is, what it means, who does it, okay? So now let's look at the current situation, right? The trends in democracy and what can be the role of the European Union and the United States within these trends, right? So an undeniable trend that we see is that there's less democracies and less freedom in the world, right? What I'm showing here is the Economist Democracy Index and the Freedom House's Freedom Index. Okay, and these are just heuristic indexes, right? So they have their own definitions of what democracy is. Freedom House has its own definition of freedom, what freedom is, and they have some indicators, and they measure these indicators in every country, right? And that those countries move up and down, you know, in their typology of democracy or freedom, right? So just if the Economist labels some country a flawed democracy doesn't mean that it necessarily is a flawed democracy. It's a flawed democracy according to their definition, obviously. But it's something that can help us sort of analyze some general trends, right? So if we look at the Democracy Index in 2008, we saw that, you know, 30 countries around the globe were considered by the index as full democracy. That's 18% of countries around the globe. If we look at the index from last year, there's a decrease, you know, in the number of countries. We have more authoritarian regimes in the world. If we look at the other graph of Freedom House, we also see a decline in freedom in general. Also, since around that time, 2008, 2009, you know, when Obama enters office, and since then we see a decline. Okay, so what is happening? This is a trend. We don't know where this trend is going to lead, obviously, but it's something that is happening globally. A decline in democratic governance and a decline in the level of freedoms, at least how freedom is defined by Freedom House, right? And perhaps, you know, the 21st century might require a different definition of what freedom is than Freedom House, who has been using this metric, you know, for decades now, right? But that, I leave that, let's say, to the discussion. Right. So one of the reasons why this is happening is that, you know, even people in the West are losing faith in democracy, right? Here you, on figure number 2, right on the left-hand side, you see a study that was published in the Journal of Democracy, which is, by the way, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and published by the National Endowment for Democracy. And it asked Americans and Europeans, according to the age group, right, which you can see on the bottom, as to whether having a democratic political system is bad, very bad, or very bad way to run this country. So in the United States, you can see that the youngest population, 16 to 24, we have almost 1/4 of the population that is saying, for some reason, that democratic political system is a bad or very bad way to run this country, right? It's arguable whether these people actually understood what was asked by them, perhaps, you know, but we see the trend even among the age groups, and we see the trend also in Europe, right? There's something going on, right? On figure number 1, again, whether it is essential to live in a country that is governed democratically, again by the age cohort, right? We see a steep decline in the United States, right? Not so much in Europe. But still, right, there is a decline in people, you know, thinking that it's essential to live in a democratic country. Okay, so what might be the reasons for that? Again, something that we can leave for discussion, but generally, is it perhaps because, you know, democracies are no longer performing the way that politicians have promised to their citizens? Is it performing below expectations, right? Have the expectations changed of these age cohorts, obviously, right? Or is it because these age cohorts, these younger people, do not have the comparison? They don't know what it's like to live in a totalitarian system, right? Or an authoritarian one, right? So they take democracy for granted, right? Perhaps the COVID situation might change this, right? Where we feel the arbitrariness to some extent of the power of the government in limiting our movement, right? As I said, I'm in lockdown in the Czech Republic at this point. Obviously, there's a reason for it, right? A public health reason for it. But we're experiencing how, you know, the governments can juggle with the reasons for why they might want to close us down at home, right? In the future, for example, right? So this arbitrariness of power, right, that is sometimes used by our governments, even during the pandemic, where there is a clear reason for shutting us down, right, might remind people of what it would be like to live in a system that uses this kind of power all the time, right? So What is the US and the EU supposed to do with it? That's the sort of overall question, right? And if we want to, however, probe this question and whether even the US and the European Union have some role in this in terms of averting this trend that we're seeing, we also have to look at what we are actually promoting when we are promoting democracy, right? So we talked about how this is going about, but what are we actually promoting? What is it, right? So some critics are saying that democracy promotion is illegitimate, right? Because it touches the cultural boundaries, right? Where some cultures are not just accepting of democracy. That is so culturally specific. Democracy has been created during in the West during the Enlightenment, etc., Athenian democracy, etc. And it's so culturally specific that it's not transferable anywhere else than in the Euro-Atlantic context, right? And I disagree with this, right? Because I see democracy as a procedure, as a process, right? Something very technical, as elections. Okay, you go to the elections, you vote for who is going to rule, right? And if you don't like the rulers, you vote them out. A very simple process, right? That is not normative. It's not bound culturally, to me, right? To me, it's a technical part. The part where democracy becomes a cultural issue is when it's linked with liberalism, right? And that's what we in the West usually consider our democracies to be, liberal democracies, right? And some leaders are criticizing this. For example, Viktor Orban, right? You know about him, saying that he actually wants to do away with the liberalism that came with the revolutions, with the transformations, and were sort of transferred to Eastern Europe through EU institutions in the United States, right? But the linkage of liberalism and democracy is extremely important, right? So what is the role of liberalism within a democracy, sort of, and linking democracy with liberalism, right? Because that's the normative framework of democracy. Democracy is technical, right? Liberalism, that's the cultural, normative aspects. Liberalism is what defines our interpersonal relations, what defines our relationship to our government, for example. Right? So. Liberalism is mostly about protecting the individual, right? It places the individual at the center, at the forefront of society, right? Unlike pre-industrial societies, right, which lived in hierarchies, in castes, right, and which lived in communities, and the individual was subservient to the community, to group decisions, etc., etc. Liberalism, right, has invented the individual, right, through the Enlightenment and through Christianity. There was this invention of the individual, which in the past was grounded in a community and in a hierarchical society. Enlightenment sort of takes the individual out, right, and then liberalism, along with the Enlightenment, take the individual out and create him as an autonomous being that can make autonomous decisions, right, So what liberalism does, it protects the individual, is this protective bubble against majorities, right, and any kind of majorities, and also against the government. Right? So liberalism is this ideology that places the individual into the forefront, right? And liberal thought basically helped the American founding fathers do away with the problems they had and with the worries they had about democracy, right? So we all know that people like James Madison were worried that this democratic experiment in the United States, right, would create autocracy, mob rule, right? That if these poor and uneducated people would be given the power to vote, right, it would cause chaos, right? Because who are they to make the right decisions, right? So they were helped with liberalism, right? Where it limits, where liberalism, and again the classical liberalism of John Locke is saying that the role of the government is to protect the property, the life and the liberty of the people, right? So liberalism basically helped to mitigate these worries in protecting every kind of minority, right? So liberal democracy is about protections of minorities, right? Because if a democracy is just a democracy, it really does become a mob rule. That's where the majority rules and the majority overrules any minority. And when I'm talking about minority, I don't mean African Americans, Asians, LGBT living in America, right? Anybody can become a minority vis-a-vis anybody, right? In terms of, the elderly are also a minority in the society. The children are a minority, right? Teachers are a minority towards the rest of the society. So you sort of never know when you are going to become a minority, right? And so that's what liberalism serves as, this protective bubble, right, against the majorities. That's why it's so difficult, for example, in our Western liberal democracies. And for example, our Czech government is building a highway, right? And there can be one farmer who has the land which the government needs to buy in order to build that highway, but it's very difficult legally to take that land away from him, right? Because again, and you can see that one farmer can basically stop, right, the building of a highway that would serve the greater public good, right? If you compare that to China, right, the Chinese government says, we're going to build the highway here, you guys have to move out, right? Simple as that. But this is what liberalism is about. It protects the individual, right? But at the same time, without democracy, liberalism becomes the dictate of the elite, right? The powerful, the resourceful, right, have all the reins and the power, right? And why I'm saying this is that this atomized individual, right, this liberal democracy that takes the individual, protects the individual, but also poses much more responsibilities on the individual, him or herself, but not vis-a-vis the rest of the society, is something very sort of culturally specific to the West, to the development of Western societies, and might not be so congruent with the political cultures of other countries. Right? I like the citation by the Indian British scholar Bhikkhu Parekh, who summarizes much better of what I was trying to explain here. Right? That he says the democratic part of liberal democracy, consisting of such things as free elections, free speech, and the right to equality, have proved far more attractive outside the West and is more universalizable than the liberal components. As non-Western societies understand it, liberalism breaks up the community, undermines the shared body of ideas and values, places the isolated individual above the community, and encourages the ethos and ethic of aggressive self-assertions. Okay. So the fact that our democracy promotion has been so much linked and understood in the context of liberal democracy, sort of promoting the liberal kind of democracy, and we have very many kinds of democracies, right? We have social democracy, we have deliberative democracy, we have consociational democracy, Athenian democracy, which was much different than the democracies that we have today. Operating in the context of liberal democracy has perhaps decreased the legitimacy of exporting this model, right? We can see it very much, for example, in Iraq, right, which is basically a socialist society, right, in 2003, right, and then a communitarian society to a large extent, right, and then you had the liberal component come in and be forcefully, applied in Iraq, where simply put, the social and the political culture of the country was not ready for it. I believe it would have no problem with democracy per se, but the liberal component, right, of making a small government, right, and empowering the individual and isolating the individual, right, proved to be problematic in its implementation. Right. So now, two last slides, and I know I'm running out of time. We have to ask ourselves: so why do democracies actually promote democracy? Right? What is the reason behind that? Right. So we have this one extreme where critics and authoritarian regimes are saying, look, this is only to topple our regimes and then to reap the proceeds and the riches and exploit our societies, right? And then we have the other extreme where some governments are saying, right, or this is just an altruistic, a humanistic approach, right? We do it only for the good of the recipient people, right? Because we care about them. We don't want them to live under oppression. Right? So these are the two extremes, and every sort of democracy promoting country has some kind of a balance, obviously, between the material interests and the normative interest, the norm-based interest, right? So obviously one point is survival in geopolitics, right? Simply put, there is this theory called democracy, the democratic peace, which says democracies have historically never been in war together, right? So against each other. So if the whole world becomes democratic, then there will be no wars, right? This is the sort of Fukuyama thinking about the end of history, right? So this survival component is obviously important, and we can see it also in the European neighborhood policy, right? If you look at the map, the European neighborhood policies wants to build some democratic cordon sanitaire along its borders, right? For reasons of survival, right? The other point that I said is solidarity and altruism. There is certainly a component of that, and solidarity is something that has driven the creation of the Eastern European countries' democracy promotion programs, like the Solidarity Fund and the Transition Promotion Program of the Czech Republic. Simply saying, look, we have received help from the West in the past, right? We have been able to break free from the oppression of communism and to consolidate our democracies and build democratic societies. So it's now our turn to help other countries, reach the point that we have. Right? So there's certainly a component of that too. There's also a component of building a domestic democratic identity, right? That democracy promotion is actually not so much of a foreign policy, but an internal policy, right? By saying that we're supporting democracy and human rights abroad, we are also supporting this identity among our own people, right? Which is particularly relevant, for example, in Eastern European countries, right? Where the society is still sort of adapting to the mechanisms of a democratic society, right? And we sort of need to build on that, right? So by our politicians going out and saying we support democracy in Belarus, we support democracy in Ukraine, it's not so much for the recipient countries, but it's for us as citizens to be constantly reminded of the fact that we are democracies and we need to consolidate this kind of identity, right? The more sort of sinister reason why democracies promote democracy, and it's more of a Marxist interpretation, right? It says basically democracy promotion is done for the global capitalist elites, right? The transnational capitalist elites, right? Because with democracy, you're also promoting market capitalism, right? You're opening up the countries to transnational capital, right? And that's why the Western liberal democracies like to promote democracy, because they're opening up the global economy, right? And who reaps the benefits, according to the Marxist, the benefits from an open global economy? It's the economic and the political elites from the so-called world system, right? So this is another sort of explanation or component. Right? And the last one is status, right? In terms of, being able to provide aid, and any kind of aid, right? Development aid often serves as a gift, right? And this gift evokes some kind of reciprocity, right? But usually for development cooperation, this reciprocity to repay, right? Sending tractors to Africa, for example. This is not what the West doesn't need to repay that, but it builds on its status, right? And it builds this symbolic domination, and it builds this symbolic hierarchy, right, between the donors and the recipients, right? And the donors feel empowered that they have the power to actually, devote some of their resources, because they're rich enough, right, to the countries that do not need so, right? So again, status in terms of, pushing up the state up in the hierarchy of the international system. So my last point, and something again that I would like us to flow into our discussion, is the most important point, right? Whether democracy assistance, democracy promotion, I've been using these words interchangeably, whether it works, right? And my simple answer is that democracy promotion is the dependent variable here, where the independent variable is the readiness of the local population and the local elites to transform the system into a democracy, right? If there's enough support, if the alternative, the new political elites that would replace the old cadres of the old regime are organized enough, well enough, right? Whether they are able enough, then the democracy support, the democracy assistance that is being provided by the Western countries is going to be successful. If opposition is disorganized, if civil society is non-existent or doesn't care about politics so much, then it is not going to work, right? And it would be an exaggeration of the powers of the institutions that I have been talking about, of the funding that is dedicated and allocated to democracy promotion. It would be an exaggeration to say that solely the EU and its mechanisms, or the US and its mechanisms, can topple a regime, except for the physical intervention, right? Because you know that critics of the so-called color revolutions in Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus, and this is something, that narrative that Russia has been furthering, is that the color revolutions have been incited by West, but by the West. Of course, there has been support to the civil society from the part of the West, right? But this is not the sole component of what is happening. I mean, you're not going to persuade a country, an entire society, to topple a regime that they like, right? There always has to be some frustration within that society, and that society to be ready to, transform the system. And unless that is there, right? There's no way that democracy promotion is going to work, right? During the Arab Spring, right, or after the Arab Spring, when the European Union reacted with increasing the budgets, right, for civil society support, for helping to organize political parties in the Arab Spring countries, right, for imposing more conditionality, right, on these countries, giving them incentives to reform, right? All of these efforts have been conducted not just by the Commission, but even the individual member states, right? Even Poland and the Czech Republic, which never really had much interest in North Africa, started sending their experts to these countries and supporting civil society there. So it was a strong effort, right, to help these countries democratize. But it didn't materialize. It didn't happen. We cannot consider any North African country or from the MENA region that was, swiped by the Arab Spring to be a democratic country at this point, except perhaps Tunisia, right? So it had very little effect, right? Simply put, because perhaps there was not enough organization on the level of the activists, right? In Ukraine, this is perhaps a different story, where we are still seeing some form of democratic consolidation, where the European Union is, for example, the Czech embassy in Ukraine, and the transition promotion program is supporting, well, you might have heard of the so-called reanimation package of reforms. It's a civil society group in Ukraine that is providing expertise to the government and recommendations on how to make democratic reforms and more transparency, battle corruption, right? So this is one of the practical initiatives that the European Union is, for example, funding. And some of these reforms are being implemented by the government, right? But we'll see where that leads, right? So at this point, I think I'm again over time, so I'm sorry about that. And I would leave it to now to the questions, which I'm very much looking forward to. So thank you, and I apologize for being a bit over time.